We often talk about identity, and sometimes it feels like these neat, established boxes we put things in.
Right?
But what happens when someone's own life, their personal story, sort of bumps up against really old traditions and in ways that, well, stir up debate, maybe even controversy?
That's exactly the kind of territory we're stepping into today. We're doing a deep dive into the history, the realities, and yeah, probably some of the misunderstandings around transgender Native Americans.
And our main source for this is a book called Two-Spirit by Tala Kwavani.
That's right.
And what makes this source so fascinating, I think, is that Tala Kwavani is speaking from a really unique place. They are both transgender and Native American.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it gets really layered.
Mm-hmm.
The author actually takes a critical look at the term Two-Spirit itself,
Mm-hmm.
and also at a lot of what we might call modern transgender ideology.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point here. Kwavani's book doesn't, pull any punches. It raises some tough questions.
Oh.
Based on their own experiences and their understanding of their heritage, they actually argue that gender dysphoria is something that needs psychological treatment rather than medical interventions like surgery or hormones.
Wow. Okay. Let's definitely unpack that because, well, it sounds like a deeply personal account that connects to some really big cultural discussions happening right now.
Absolutely.
So for everyone listening, as we get into this, what's our aim here? What should we be trying to understand?
Well, our goal is really to explore this complex topic through the very specific lens of Kwavani's book. We're not setting out to provide the final word or take sides.
Right.
It's more about exploring the historical background, the personal journey Kwavani shares, and the specific critique they offer. We'll look at pre-colonial gender views, how Two-Spirit came about, and Kwavani's issues with it, always staying focused on what's in this particular source.
Got it. So let's start right at the beginning then, with Tala Kwavani's own story. What were those early experiences like, the ones that led them to sort of grapple with their gender identity?
Well, Kwavani describes feeling different from, a very young age. Even as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
there was this strong sense of identifying more with boys and a real physical discomfort with the female gender they were assigned at birth.
All right.
They talk about things like trying to hide their chest developing, feeling this fundamental mismatch between who they felt they were inside and what society expected of them as a girl in their community. It sounds like it was, a really profound internal struggle right from the start.
That sounds incredibly difficult, especially for a child.
Uh-huh.
So how did the term Two-Spirit come into the picture for them?
Kwavani came across the term Two-Spirit later on, I believe, at a community center. And at first, it sounded like an answer.
A potential
Well,
explanation.
exactly. A way to maybe make sense of that internal conflict, that feeling Kwavani describes as being like a boy in a girl's shell. The term seemed to point to a history, traditions where people who didn't fit neatly into male or female roles were actually recognized, maybe even respected.
So like finding a piece that fits, perhaps. A moment of connection.
It must have felt like that initially, yeah. But you mentioned earlier that this feeling, this initial hope, it didn't quite stick. Why did that disillusionment set in?
Right. That initial feeling started to shift as Kwavani began to feel that Two-Spirit was maybe too neat, too polished, that it lacked what they call the real grit of our real stories. It started to feel less like an authentic reflection and maybe more like an external label, not quite capturing the complexity of being Dene and also queer. It didn't fully resonate.
And wasn't there also the issue that it wasn't a term familiar to the older generation in their family?
It's a really key detail, yes. Kwavani mentions their grandmother, who was, a holder of Dene traditions and language, had never heard of the term Two-Spirit,
Oh, wow.
which led Kwavani to understand that it was actually a pretty recent term, coined only in 1990 at a conference up in Winnipeg.
Okay, 1990. So not an ancient term rooted deep in tradition, in their view. Not in the way it's sometimes presented, according to Kwavani. It felt constructed, a patch, as they put it, not our weave, something added later, not something that grew organically from within the specific Dene traditions they knew.
So the perception was that it was created perhaps with good intentions, but outside of their specific cultural context.
Precisely. Kwavani sees Two-Spirit as a pan-Indian term, trying to cover many different native nations under one umbrella.
Right.
And while that might aim for inclusivity, Kwavani argues the effect is that it actually flattens out the very specific, unique ways different tribes understood gender before this term existed. Names like Nadlehi, Winkte, Lamana, Bate, each tied to a particular nation with its own history and meaning, were kind of getting lumped together.
And that feeling of losing that tribal specificity, that seems like a really core motivation for writing the book itself.
Absolutely. A major goal for Kwavani seems to be to, as they say, dig past the muck of these modern interpretations and try to find the bones of those who came before. To explore the gaps, the silences, the questions around gender and sexuality in Native history, but always anchoring it back to specific tribal identities and understandings, not a generalized term.
Which, of course, brings us to that question.
Yeah.
How was gender understood in those pre-colonial times before all these external forces came into play? What does the author say about that?
Kwavani asserts that before colonization, many Native peoples had a much more fluid concept of gender. They saw it more like a spectrum, not the strict male-female binary that Europeans brought.
Okay.
And the book gives some really powerful examples of specific tribal roles that embodied this fluidity.
Like the Nadlihi you mentioned, from the Navajo people.
Exactly. The Nadlihi are described as individuals seen as embodying both masculine and feminine spirits. And crucially, they weren't just accepted, they were often revered. They held important roles as skilled weavers, healers, sometimes visionaries. They represented a kind of balance.
So it wasn't just about who they were, but what they did for the community.
Precisely. Their role was functional and respected. And similarly, the Winkte among the Lakota people.
Right, the Winkte. What was their role?
The Winkte were also held in high regard, often seen as having unique spiritual gifts. They acted as visionaries, healers, and were sometimes given the really significant task of naming children. That tells you something about their spiritual standing in Lakota society.
And the Lamana, among the Zuni.
Yes, the Lamana. Wiwa is probably the most famous historical example.
I've heard that name.
Right. Lamana were often skilled in crafts like weaving, pottery, things maybe associated with women, but they also took on roles like mediators or even diplomats, bridging different spheres. Wiwa actually traveled to Washington, D.C. in the 1880s, met President Cleveland. It shows their respected status and engagement beyond just the Pueblo.
And the Bate of the Crow Nation. You mentioned them too.
The Bate, yes. Oshtish is a notable figure there. They were known as fierce warriors, participating in battles.
So a traditionally masculine role.
Exactly, but they also excelled in traditionally feminine arts, like intricate beadwork. Oshtish was famous for bravery in the Battle of the Rosebud, but was also a skilled craftsperson. It really shows that multifaceted nature, combining roles we might see as strictly male or female.
It really sounds like these weren't just, fringe figures who were tolerated. They were integral, honored parts of their societies.
That's the key point Kwavani emphasizes. These individuals were often revered for their unique contributions. They weren't seen as wrong or other. They had a place. But, and this is also crucial, these roles were very specific to each tribe. Nadlihi is a Navajo concept, Winkte is Lakota, Lamana is Zuni, Bate is Crow. It wasn't one single idea shared everywhere. Each nation had its own terms, its own understanding.
Which makes the impact of colonialism even more devastating, presumably, if it attacked these very specific respected roles.
Absolutely. Colonialism, through missionaries imposing rigid Christian views, through boarding schools designed to erase native culture, through imposing European laws, it directly attacked these fluid gender systems. Kwavani uses strong words saying it tore that fabric apart.
Right.
It imposed this strict male-female binary, often with force, punishing those who didn't conform, suppressing the very languages and traditions that held these understandings.
Creating these voids that the author talks about.
Exactly. As these traditional roles were suppressed, stigmatized, punished, it left these gaps, these voids in the cultural understanding. And it's into this space, this context of loss and disruption, that the term two-spirit later emerges, trying to maybe bridge back to some of those pre-colonial ideas.
But as Kwavani argues, maybe bringing its own set of problems.
Yeah. Yes. While Kwavani acknowledges two-spirit offered a lifeline, a sense of community for some who felt lost, they worry deeply that it risks flattening out that very tribal diversity it aims to represent. Kwavani even calls it potentially a white remix of our ruin, suggesting it might be imposing a Western way of categorizing onto something intrinsically indigenous and diverse.
That's a very powerful phrase.
Yeah.
Can you give some specific examples from the book of how colonial powers actually went about suppressing these roles?
Yeah, the book gives some stark examples. Spanish conquistadors encountering the Nadlihi They saw it through their own religious lens, called it sodomy, devilry,
Oh, dear.
and they actively tried to force Nudlihi individuals into European male or female roles, often brutally. Then you have French fur traders and Jesuit priests looking at the Lakota Winkte, calling them effeminate, unnatural, demanding they act like European men. There were attempts to shame them, punish them.
And government agencies, too.
Yes, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, for instance, targeted Zuni Lamana like Wifwa, trying to force them into farming roles considered male or domestic roles considered female, actively trying to break down their fluid social and economic contributions.
It paints a really grim picture, doesn't it? This targeted effort to erase these ways of being.
It really does. And Kravani stresses this wasn't isolated. It was part of that larger colonial project. Forced assimilation, banning ceremonies, banning languages, undermining every aspect of Native culture and worldview, including how gender and sexuality were understood.
So it's against that really damaging history that the term Two-Spirit comes into existence in 1990. Tell us more about that moment, that conference in Winnipeg.
Right, so it was August 1990, the third annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian Conference in Winnipeg. It was a significant gathering. And Myra Laramie, a Cree elder, is widely credited with proposing or introducing the term Two-Spirit there. It was a conscious act of self-naming by Native LGBTQ+ people.
And the main reason was to get rid of that older, offensive term.
Exactly. The primary goal was to replace Burdek. That word, which has Persian and French origins, was seen as derogatory, inaccurate, and imposed by outsiders. It completely failed to capture the respected, sometimes sacred nature of these roles in many traditions.
So the intention was positive, to create something Native-specific, more respectful.
Absolutely. The goal was to have a term rooted in Native understanding, meant to honor those diverse gender expressions and provide a positive, culturally relevant identity.
But Kuvani, while seeing that intention, still has major issues with the term itself.
Yes. Despite the good intentions, Kuvani describes it as feeling like a hasty stitch, an attempt to, quote, translate white ways and white understandings that have never really worked for us. The feeling is that it tries to fit these complex, tribally specific realities into a framework that's maybe easier for Western minds to grasp, but loses vital nuance in the translation.
That big, blurry hug analogy Kuvani uses really captures that feeling, doesn't it?
It really does. Kuvani feels Two-Spirit risks sweeping the unique experiences from all these different nations, Navajo, Lakota, Zuni, Crow, hundreds of others, into one single vague category.
Right.
And in doing so, it sands down, as they put it, the specific tribal truths, the unique histories. The book even mentions others feeling it was for the cameras, for outsiders, or that it rubbed raw against tribal specificity, just didn't feel right for their own culture.
And Kuvani's own journey reflects this, initially finding it helpful, but then feeling it fell short for their own identity as DNA and queer.
Absolutely. That personal arc is central. Kuvani talks about how Two-Spirit first seemed like that lifeline, a way to make star of things. But over time, it just didn't feel deep enough, didn't have the grit, the realness of their lived experience. It didn't quite connect with their deep roots in Diné and Hopi culture, nor fully capture their specific experience of being transgender in today's world. It felt like a generalization that missed the mark for them personally.
Which brings us to a really complex, and I imagine potentially quite controversial section of the book, where the author discusses sex, gender, and what they refer to as transgender ideology.
Yes, this is definitely where Kuvani's views diverge sharply from a lot of the current mainstream discussion about transgender identity. The author states quite plainly their belief that, in their traditional understanding, sex and gender are the same thing.
Okay.
And what we often call gender roles, Kuvani sees as just that, roles, like jobs, not something fundamental to your core being in the same way as biological sex. That's a key distinction for them.
And they see the modern Western ideas about gender fluidity as something foreign, maybe even harmful to Native ways of thinking.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right.
Kuvani describes the current white gender and sex confusion, as they call it, as a tiring and cultural mess for us Natives. Contrasting it directly with what they present as the traditional view. Bodies are typically male or female, with intersex variations acknowledged but seen as rare biological realities. They see the Western focus on gender as fluid and socially constructed, as clashing with their ancestral understanding.
And the book makes a very strong claim about the origin of transgender identity and gender dysphoria itself.
It does. Quivani argues quite starkly that transgender and gender dysphoria came from the whites, and they draw that really intense parallel we mentioned earlier, comparing it to diseases like smallpox,
Ah,
implying it's a harmful import, something that's negatively impacted Native people. It's a very provocative statement in the book.
a very strong statement. So what's the author's overall assessment of the transgender movement as laid out in the book?
Quivani is highly critical. They use terms like sick and twisted to describe the movement. The core argument seems to be that it incorrectly tells people their bodies are fundamentally wrong, a mistake, which Quivani views as deeply damaging.
And the proposed alternative.
Instead of medical transition, Quivani advocates for addressing gender dysphoria through psychotherapy and also traditional Native healing practices, things like sweat lodges, seeking guidance from Native therapists, focusing on the psychological and spiritual aspects rather than hormones or surgery.
And there's that very pointed analogy the book uses to illustrate this view on affirmation versus treatment.
Yes, the analogy is comparing affirming a transgender person's identity to affirming a psychiatric patient who believes they are Napoleon,
It's okay.
suggesting that in Quivani's view, affirmation ignores underlying psychological issues that need treatment rather than validation of what they see as a delusion. It's a very controversial comparison, highlighting their deep skepticism about medical transition pathways.
The book also raises specific worries about Native youth, doesn't it?
Yes, significant concerns. Quivani talks about a perceived two-spirit craze, potentially hyped by non-natives, leading young Native people towards what the author sees as harmful medical steps, sterilization, irreversible surgeries.
Mm-hmm.
And they make that deeply disturbing comparison to historical trauma, likening these modern interventions to the gifts of the past, like smallpox blankets deliberately given to harm Native communities, suggesting this modern trend could be similarly destructive.
And this isn't just theoretical for Kovani. They share their own experience with medical transition, right?
That's a really critical part of their story. Quivani is very open about having pursued testosterone treatment and undergoing a double mastectomy.
Right.
But crucially, they describe experiencing profound regret afterwards, feeling like, and this is their quote, a Dr. Mengele and Frankenstein experiment. It conveys a deep sense of disillusionment with their own medical transition and raises serious questions for them about its long-term impact.
The book also brings in the voices of elders like Diane to support this perspective.
Yes, Diane's perspective is presented as reinforcing this view. She emphasizes the connection traditional cultures had with nature.
Okay.
Diane suggests that pre-colonial Native people didn't really think about gender in the modern Western way. That division of labor was about survival, skills, practicality, not rigid gender scripts dictating who you fundamentally were.
And she uses that analogy about camouflage.
Right. The analogy is wearing green clothes to blend in with trees doesn't actually turn you into a tree. The implication being that changing your appearance or behavior doesn't change your underlying biological sex, which aligns directly with Quivani's core belief about sex being immutable.
So this whole journey, the personal experiences, the critiques, the elder perspectives, it all leads Quivani to reject both the trans label and the two-spirit concept as it's often used today.
Exactly. Quivani describes it as stepping away from what felt like performing a script, maybe for others, and returning to what felt like a more authentic, grounded identity as Dene and Hopi, finding belonging and truth in their specific ancestral roots rather than these broader and, for them, problematic labels.
So if two-spirit is seen as this modern colonial crutch, as the author puts it, what's the path forward they advocate for instead?
Quivani makes a strong call to move away from two-spirit and instead actively reclaim and understand those specific tribal terms, Natalehi, Winkta, Lamana, Bate, and others. The power, in their view, lies in rediscovering and honoring these distinct cultural identities.
And stressing that these are much more than just labels.
Far more. According to Quivani, these terms represent specific roles, carrying responsibilities, unique histories, and even spiritual connections tied to particular tribes and their ways of life. They aren't interchangeable. They hold a richness that gets lost under a single generic term.
And the book mentions that there are efforts happening now in Native communities to bring these traditions back.
Yes. It highlights that various Native communities are actively working to revitalize these specific terms and the knowledge around them through things like language classes, cultural programs, community initiatives, efforts to make sure these ancestral understandings aren't forgotten and that younger generations can connect with this part of their heritage.
It really sounds like For Kwavani, it boils down to honoring the specific struggles and resilience of their own ancestors.
That comes through very strongly. The argument is that their ancestors fought and endured to preserve their specific cultures, their specific ways, not for some generalized pan-Indian label created recently. Kwavani sees preserving cultural authenticity, the languages, the stories, these unique roles as a vital lifeline.
And this critique extends to how the term Two-Spirit has sometimes been used by people outside the Native community.
Yes, Kwavani is critical of what they see as the appropriation of Two-Spirit by non-natives, and also describes a kind of liberal hijack of the term, arguing it's often taken out of its deep cultural context and used superficially without real respect for its complexities or the lived experiences of the Native people whose traditions it's supposed to represent.
Okay. So as we start to wrap up this really complex and quite challenging deep dive, what would you say are the main tensions that Tala Kwavani's book brings to the surface?
Well, I think the core tension is right there at that intersection of personal gender identity, the complex and often erased history of diverse gender roles within specific Native cultures, and then Kwavani's very pointed critique of both the term Two-Spirit and modern transgender ideology. It really throws a spotlight on that conflict between using broader pan-Indian terms versus the drive to preserve very specific tribal identities. And of course, the fundamentally different views presented in the book on the nature of gender dysphoria and how it should be addressed.
And it's so important, as we've said, to keep reminding ourselves what our source is here.
Absolutely critical. This entire conversation has been based solely on the perspectives and arguments presented by Tala Kwavani in their book, Two-Spirit. It's one specific, deeply personal viewpoint within a much larger, ongoing, and very multifaceted conversation happening within Native communities and far beyond.
So what is Kwavani's ultimate stance then, as presented in the book? What's the main takeaway they offer regarding identity and well-being?
Kwavani ultimately calls for rejecting those broad, potentially homogenizing labels, and instead advocates for a return to and a deep honoring of rooted specific tribal identities and the traditional understandings of gender embedded within them. And alongside that, based on their personal journey and cultural understanding, they express a very clear preference for psychological treatment and traditional healing methods for gender dysphoria over and against medical interventions like hormones and surgery.
It's certainly a powerful perspective and definitely gives us and our listeners a lot to think about.
Yeah.
What final thought could we leave people with as they process this deep dive?
Maybe just reflecting on how profoundly historical events and contemporary ideas shape our understanding of something as personal as identity. And also the real importance of seeking out and trying to genuinely understand the diverse range of perspectives that exist within any cultural context, especially when we're talking about issues this sensitive, this personal, like gender identity and cultural heritage.
If listeners want to explore this further, what could they look into?
Well, delving into the specific histories and cultural meanings of those individual tribal roles we mentioned, Nadlihi, Wingte, Lamana, Bate, and others, learning about their unique contexts would be incredibly valuable. And also, researching the ongoing discussions, the different viewpoints within contemporary Native communities about gender identity today, that would definitely offer a broader, richer picture of this complex landscape.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's certainly been thought-provoking.